The morning I found the woodpile, I was sitting on the splitting stump trying to remember how to breathe. Not the way a man sits when he's tired, the way a man sits when the air won't come, and his chest has gone tight and the axe handle is still in his hand, but he can't quite recall picking it up. The round I'd been trying to lift was sitting 3 feet away in the frost-killed grass, maybe 20 inches of red oak, maybe 50 pounds, and I had not been able to get it up onto the block a second time. I'd got it up once, swung twice. On the third swing, my lungs told me we were done for the day, and that was that. I sat down on the stump, and I looked at the tree line, and Biscuit came over and put his chin on my knee, the way he used to do when something was wrong. I want to tell you what I saw that evening, a couple of weeks after that morning. I want to tell you what was stacked in the woodyard when I came out at dusk, and what was standing at the edge of the trees, watching me understand it. But to make sense of any of that, I need to go back to the autumn before and the winter before that, and a woman named Dottie who used to put dried corn on a flat stone every morning so the yard birds would have something. I'd worked 38 years in the Harlan County coal mines, started at 21 with strong lungs and a new marriage and the general idea that I was built to last. Retired at 63 when the company doctor put the word on paper. Black lung. Progressive fibrosis of the tissue, he said, which is the medical way of saying that enough coal dust had settled in my chest over enough decades that my lungs were slowly becoming something that no longer worked quite like lungs. I wasn't going to suffocate on a Tuesday afternoon. He was clear about that. It was going to be a gradual narrowing. Less oxygen exchange over time, less capacity for exertion, the body learning to ask less of itself. Dottie said we'd manage. She always said that, and she was nearly always right. We'd had the cabin on the ridge in Scott County for 30 years by then, bought it cheap in the mid-'80s when I was still bringing home decent pay, and we needed somewhere to put a weekend. 2 rooms and a porch and 6 acres of mixed hardwood running up into the ridge proper. A woodyard off the south side of the cabin where I'd stacked cordwood every September since before Ray was old enough to carry a single round without dropping it. Dottie loved it up there. She said the air tasted different, and she was right about that too. She died in the October 2 years before the autumn this story is about. Went fast, which I know is supposed to be a mercy. Aneurysm, a doctor in Norton told me, and I stood in the hospital hallway with my coat still on and my truck keys in my hand, and I did not have a single useful thought for what felt like a long time. Ray drove up from Roanoke and handled most of the arrangements because I was not handling them. He did not say anything unkind about that. He did say more than once that I should come stay in Roanoke for a while, that the apartment had a spare room, that I did not need to be up on that ridge alone. I said I was fine. I said it the way a man says it when he needs the conversation to stop. Ray drove back to Roanoke in early November, and I drove up to the cabin. I told myself it was just for the winter. I did not go back down. The estrangement between Ray and me was not dramatic. There was no fight, no slammed door, no particular thing said that I cannot unsay. It was a phone that I stopped picking up, and a phone that eventually stopped ringing, and the silence that settled in between us was the kind of silence that gets more comfortable the longer you let it sit, until you realize one day that comfort and numbness are not quite the same thing. I knew where he was. He knew I was alive. We did not speak for most of 2 years, and I told myself that was fine too. I am not a person who comes naturally to honesty about what he feels. I want to be clear about that up front. I spent 38 years underground with men who expressed the full range of their interior lives through 4 or 5 words and a particular tilt of the chin, and I was one of those men, and I am still one of those men. I am telling you what I saw and what I did and what changed, and you can decide what to do with it. The first winter alone on the ridge, I got through on canned goods and stubbornness, and a wood stove that Dottie and I had replaced the flue collar on, together maybe 6 years prior. The second winter, the one this story is about, I was 71 years old and my lungs were worse than they'd been the year before, which is the nature of progressive fibrosis. The company doctor in Harlan had been right. The world was getting smaller, measured in how far I could walk before I had to stop, how much I could lift before the breathlessness came on like a tide coming in. I need to say something about the wood stove, because it matters. Cabin stoves up on that ridge run best with a cut length of 14 inches. I'd been cutting to 18 for years because I had a serviceable wood splitter and a strong back, and it made the splitting easier. You can run 18-inch rounds in most stoves if you angle them in right. I'd done it for 30 years. The winter before, I was still cutting my own rounds, still stacking a full cord each September, still managing. I was slow about it, taking longer rests than I used to. But I was getting it done. The September of the year this story is about, I got about a third of a cord stacked before my body sat down on the splitting stump and explained to me that we were not going to finish on this timeline. The rounds I'd cut were too heavy. 18 inches of red oak is a serious piece of wood, and getting it up onto the splitting block requires a particular kind of lift, a bend at the waist, and a curl of the arms that my lungs had decided was no longer in the available range. I could do it once or twice in a session. Then my chest would close down and the grey would come in at the edges of my vision, and I would sit on the stump and breathe carefully until the grey receded. Biscuit would come over during those sits. He was 12 years old that autumn, which is old for a beagle, and he moved slowly and slept a great deal and did not pretend to be anything other than what he was. He had been Dottie's dog first. She had picked him out of a litter her friend Lena brought up to the cabin one May, a fat brown and white pup that Dottie named Biscuit on the spot because she said he was the colour and shape of one and there was nothing else to call him. He became mine by proximity and time, the way animals do. And after Dottie was gone, he slept at the foot of my cot and followed me from room to room and put his chin on my knee when the mornings got too quiet. It was during one of those stump sits in early September that I started back up with Dottie's corn ritual. She had done it every morning for as long as I could remember. A small pottery dish, glazed in a brown and cream pattern, that she kept on the kitchen windowsill and filled with dried feed corn. Each morning she carried it out to the flat stone at the edge of the wood yard, the one that stuck up about 8 inches out of the ground, wide and flat-topped, maybe the size of a dinner plate. She'd set the dish on the stone and tap it twice with her finger, which I always thought was a private signal between her and the birds. And then she'd go back inside and let the morning come. Cardinals mostly, some nuthatches, the occasional chickadee. She knew them all by behaviour even when she couldn't see the markings clearly, knew which one was the skittish one and which one would stay on the stone, even when you walked within 10 feet. I had not kept the ritual up after she died. The first winter I told myself I didn't know where she kept the corn. That was a lie. It was in a blue metal pail on the bottom shelf of the pantry, where she'd always kept it. The second winter, I told myself, the birds managed fine without it. That was true, but it wasn't the reason. That September morning, sitting on the splitting stump with my hand on Biscuit's head and the grey just clearing from the edges of my vision, I looked at the flat stone and it was empty, and it had been empty for 2 years. And I went inside and got the blue pail and the pottery dish, and I filled the dish and carried it out and set it on the stone. I did not tap it twice. I couldn't quite do that part. I kept the dish going every morning after that. Filled it, carried it out, set it on the stone. The birds found it inside a week. The wood problem I couldn't solve. I had roughly 2/3 of a cord left to split and stack before the cold hit hard, and I was not going to be able to do it at my current rate. I thought about calling Ray. I picked up the phone twice and put it down. I thought about asking my neighbour Lloyd, who ran a small sawmill down on the county road and was a decent enough man, but Lloyd had a bad hip himself, and I did not want to explain why I couldn't do my own wood. I thought about hiring it out, but the thought of a stranger up on my ridge with a chainsaw felt wrong in a way I couldn't reason with. So I kept going at my own pace, a few rounds a day when the breathlessness allowed it, and I added to the stack slowly. And Biscuit lay in the wood yard and watched me with his old dog Patience, and the corn dish stayed full on the flat stone, and September became October. Now, I want to tell you that if you have spent a good portion of your life in the natural world, working in it rather than visiting it, you develop a catalogue of ordinary sounds. You know what a ridgeline sounds like at mid-morning in early October. You know what the wind does through white oak versus through hemlock. You know the particular hush that falls when a hawk is working the thermals above the tree canopy, because the small birds go quiet and the squirrels pause in their running. You know all of that the way you know the sound of your own engine, and when something in that catalogue goes missing, your body registers it before your mind has caught up. The first wrong morning came about a week into October. I was out at the woodyard at first light, trying to get one session done before the cold made my chest worse. Biscuit was beside me. The morning was still, the sky the colour of old pewter above the ridge, and I was setting around on the block when I noticed that there was no sound from the tree line. Not the particular hawk hush, not that settling. Something else, something I didn't have a precise name for. The hemlock at the edge of the wood yard, maybe 40 feet from where I was standing, was perfectly still. No wind had come yet, so that was normal. The stillness of the trees was normal. What was not normal was that the 2 grey squirrels that I had been hearing in those hemlocks every morning for 6 weeks were not there. Not just quiet, gone. The sound of them, the skittering and the soft thumping of pine cones they'd been dropping, was simply absent. Biscuit was sitting at the edge of the wood yard facing the tree line. His tail moved once, slowly, the way it moved when he recognized something. Not the alert posture he'd have taken for a deer or a stranger. The calm, settled posture of a dog who has identified something and decided it is not worth barking at. I told myself a fox had come through. I had seen fox sign up on the ridge before, and they did quiet the squirrels. I told myself that and went back to my splitting. The second wrong morning came 3 days later, and the fox explanations started to strain. I'd come out just before dusk that time, not at first light, because the afternoon had been warmer and I wanted to try to add another few rounds to the stack, while I could still work without my chest clamping down. The light was going gold and long through the hemlock, the kind of October light in southwest Virginia that makes even plain things look like they were lit for a purpose. I'd split maybe 6 rounds and stacked them, and I was standing with my hands on my thighs, catching my breath, when I noticed that the stack looked different. It took me a minute to figure out what I was seeing. The wood I'd added that afternoon was cut to 18 inches, same as everything else in the stack. The wood beside it, maybe a dozen rounds that I was fairly sure I had split 3 days prior, was shorter. Not by much. Not enough that I'd have noticed if I hadn't been standing exactly there in exactly that light. But they were shorter. I pulled one out and held it against the length of my arm the way I'd always estimated. 14 inches. Maybe a touch under. I have to tell you that my first thought was that I had cut them wrong, that my measurements were off, which happens. I'd been using a notched stick as a length guide for 30 years, and I knew that stick down to the grain, but I told myself my hands had slipped. My eye had been off. I set the round back in the stack. The third morning, I found 6 more shorter rounds in the stack, cut clean, ends pale where the wood was fresh. I had not been out to the wood yard the evening before. I'd been inside with a bad chest day, sitting by the wood stove and not doing much of anything useful. 6 rounds, cut to 14 inches, stacked in with mine. I sat down on the splitting stump and looked at them for a long time. I went through the list. Lloyd from the sawmill was the obvious candidate. He was the only neighbour I had within reasonable distance, and he was the kind of man who might do a quiet favour without announcing it. I drove down to his place that afternoon and asked him, straight out, if he'd been up on my ridge. He looked at me the way a man looks when he genuinely doesn't know what you're talking about. "I haven't been up your road in 2 months," he said. "My hip's been giving me grief. You need help up there. I can send my boy." I told him I was fine. I drove back up to the ridge and I sat on the porch with Biscuit and I looked at the tree line and I thought about what else could explain it. A hiker who happened to have a saw and happened to stack the cut wood neatly in with mine and happened to do it without leaving any other trace. A hunter who'd taken a notion, my own memory failing me, the cut somehow done during a morning I couldn't account for. I went through it all and none of it held, and it was during that particular failure of explanation, sitting on the cold porch with Biscuit's warm flank against my shin, that something shifted in the way I was paying attention. I was paying attention differently after that. Not anxious attention, not the vigilant kind. Something more patient. I started coming out to the wood yard at different hours, early and late, in the half-light and in the full dark, standing quiet the way you learn to stand quiet underground when you're listening for something you can't see. Biscuit came with me every time. He never barked. He never hackled up. He'd face the tree line and his tail would move that one slow sweep, and then he'd settle down and watch the hemlocks the way an old dog watches a fire. I started finding more, shorter rounds, 2 or 3 at a time, never while I was there to see it happen. Always cut clean, always stacked improper. I measured one carefully with a rule I brought out from the kitchen. 14 inches exactly. 14 inches is the length you want for a small cabin stove. The length that lets you load and close the door without fighting the wood into position. It is the length a man with limited breath needs, because fighting a piece of wood into a stove takes more out of you than it sounds. Whoever was cutting those rounds knew something about how a small cabin stove worked. That was the thing I kept coming back to. It wasn't random help, it was help that fit. The corn dish was still going out every morning. The birds had established a routine I could set my clock by, the cardinal pair arriving first, always, the male sitting in the hemlock for a full minute before he came down, looking the yard over the way he always did. I watched them from the kitchen window over coffee, the way Dottie had watched them, and I thought about her, and I let the thought sit without trying to push it anywhere. It was a Wednesday in the 3rd week of October, late afternoon going into dusk, when everything came to a point. I'd had a decent day by my own current standards. Breathable air, not too cold, and I'd split a good dozen rounds and stacked them without sitting down more than twice. I was feeling something close to useful, which was rare enough that I noticed it. Biscuit had been in the wood yard with me the whole session. When I finally put the axe down and straightened up, he was not at my feet. He was standing at the far end of the wood yard about 10 feet from the hemlock line, facing the trees. His tail was wagging, slow and certain. Not excited, not alarmed, the way a dog wags when it sees someone it's met before and trusts. The light was going amber and thin. The hemlocks at the edge of the yard were dark where the sun had left them. I stood beside my splitting stump and I waited, because I understood by then that something had been here more than once, and whatever it was had not harmed anything, and I was not going to start being afraid of it now. The silence came first. The same gone quiet that I'd registered on the first wrong morning, the squirrels down, the small birds off the stone and into the brush. My body had learned to mark that silence as a kind of arriving, the way you mark a change in air pressure before a weather shift comes through. Then I saw it. I want to be careful here because I am a man who has spent his life refusing to overstep what he actually knows. And I know that I am about to describe something for which I do not have a category that I am willing to stand behind in full daylight. I am not going to call it anything. I have tried several names in the privacy of my own thinking over the 2 years since, and none of them feel right, and the ones that feel closest are not ones I can say out loud to a man like Lloyd at the end of his driveway, without losing his good regard for me. What I saw was large, larger than anything I had seen standing at the edge of a tree line. It was standing at the border of the hemlocks and the cleared yard, maybe 50 feet from where I was, and it was dark-furred. The fur the colour of a shadow in October low light. It was standing straight and still, not the crouch of a bear, not the rangy posture of anything else I could name. The shape of it was wrong for every category I had, and I had spent a lot of years in wild country building up those categories. It turned toward me. I am telling you that I did not move, not out of bravery, out of something else, something that was closer to recognition than to fear. The way you go, still not, because you're scared, but because something has your full attention, and you understand without words that moving would be the wrong thing. Biscuit sat down. Right there at the edge of the wood yard, 10 feet from the tree line, the old beagle sat down on the frozen ground and did not make a sound. The creature stood at the threshold of the hemlocks and the cleared yard, and it looked at me, and I looked at it, and the light went lower, and the air smelled like cold bark and wood smoke from my own flue, and I do not have a word for what moved through me in that moment. I have been looking for one ever since. It was not fear. It was not joy exactly. It was something closer to the feeling a man gets when he puts down a weight he's been carrying so long he'd stopped noticing. It was heavy, and his hands come up empty, and he stands there surprised by his own lightness. Then it moved into the wood yard, not toward me, toward the unsplit rounds stacked at the far end. The rounds I hadn't got to yet, the ones that were still 18 inches and 50 pounds each, and had been sitting there since early September waiting for a version of me that no longer existed. It moved through the wood yard with a slowness that was deliberate, not cautious, the way a person moves when they know where they're going and are not in any rush about it. Biscuit watched it, and his tail swept the ground once. I stood at my splitting stump and I watched it work. What it did was simple, and it was not simple. It took each round and it cut it, and the cuts it made were clean and even, and the lengths they produced were 14 inches. I could not see precisely how the cuts were being made in the failing light. But the sound was not a saw sound. It was a sound I did not recognize, a clean separation, and what remained of each round when it was done were pieces a man with limited breath could pick up and carry to the stove without the grey coming in at the edges of his vision. It stacked them as it went, placing each piece with a care that was patient and unhurried, the way you'd stack wood if you had all evening and a reason to get it right. My chest was tight, not from exertion, from the effort of holding still, of breathing carefully, of not looking away from what I was seeing. It worked through all the remaining rounds, every one I hadn't been able to manage. When the last piece was set in the stack, it stood there for a moment with its back partly to me, and I understood that it was giving me time to look at what it had done. The full cord of wood now split and stacked and cut to a length I could manage through a winter, alone on a ridge with lungs that were getting smaller every year. Then it turned toward me again, one more time. I cannot tell you what passed between us in that moment. I have tried to put it into language, and the language falls apart every time I get close. There are things that happen at the threshold of what a man is able to hold in his head, and the only honest thing to say about them is that they happened and that they changed you. The creature turned back to the hemlock line. It walked into the trees without hurrying, without looking back, and the hemlock swallowed it the way the dark swallows everything at dusk in those Virginia hills, cleanly, without drama, as if it had simply stepped from one room into another. And then the squirrels were back in the canopy, rattling around in the dark, and a cardinal called once from somewhere in the brush, and Biscuit got up off the frozen ground and walked over to me and sat on my foot, which was something he had not done since Dottie died. I stood in the woodyard for a long time after that. The cold came in proper once the sun was fully gone, and I should have gone inside, but I wasn't ready to be in the cabin yet. I needed the open air and the smell of the hemlocks and the weight of the full dark sky over the ridge. I put my hand on one of the 14-inch pieces at the top of the stack. The cut end was smooth under my fingers, and the wood was dense and dry, and it would burn hot and long. Dottie's corn dish sat on the flat stone at the edge of the yard, pale in the dark. I looked at it for a while. I went inside when Biscuit started shivering, which was the only grounds for ending a thing like that. I didn't sleep well. Not because I was frightened, because my mind kept returning to the woodyard and the stack and the 14-inch lengths, and the particular way a deliberate kindness lands differently than an accidental one. There is a difference between stumbling upon something good and receiving something given. I knew which one that had been. In the morning I got up before light and filled the corn dish and carried it out to the flat stone and set it down. I tapped it twice with my finger. Then I went back inside and I stood at the kitchen counter with the phone in my hand for what was probably 5 minutes. Ray picked up on the third ring. His voice was careful in the way a voice gets when it's been a long time and neither party knows the temperature of things. "Dad," he said. "Ray," I said, and then I ran out of the easy part. I stood at the counter and I held the phone, and I listened to him breathe, and I tried to find the right sentence, and I couldn't find it, so I said, the only true thing I had. I should have called sooner. He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." We talked for 40 minutes. Not about the wood or the ridge or what had happened in the yard the evening before. About Dottie. About the hospital hallway and the coat I'd never taken off. About the November he'd driven back to Roanoke and how he'd sat in his truck at the bottom of the ridge road for 20 minutes before he'd put it in gear, wishing I'd come down and knock on the window and tell him to wait. I didn't know that. He'd never said it, and I hadn't known. I didn't tell him what I'd seen in the wood yard. I thought about it and decided I wouldn't. Not then. It wasn't the right phone call for that story. The right phone call for that story would have to be one where we were sitting at a table with coffee between us and the time to follow it wherever it went. I filed that away as a thing to look forward to. He said he'd come up to the ridge in November if that was all right. I said it was more than all right. He said he'd bring a casserole from the diner his girlfriend worked at, the one on the 220 corridor, and I said that sounded fine. He said he might stay 2 or 3 days, and I said the cot in the second room was available and the wood stove worked well. I did not tell him that I had enough wood to last the winter. I let that be a thing he'd see when he pulled in and got out of his truck and looked at the stack. When we hung up, I stood at the window with my hand on the sill for a while, looking at the yard in the early light. The flat stone was visible from there, the corn dish sitting on it in the grey morning. The cardinal pair had already found it, the male on the stone, the female in the hemlock 2 feet away. Same routine as always, same order. The rest of October came and went in its ordinary way. I loaded the wood stove in the mornings and in the evenings, pulling pieces from the stack at the end of the wood yard, 14-inch lengths that I could carry 2 at a time in the crook of my arm without my chest closing down. I kept the corn dish going. Biscuit slept by the stove and followed me out to the yard in the mornings and lay in the pale sun on the porch steps in the afternoons, when the sun was still warm enough to matter. I watched the tree line, not anxiously. I was not expecting a return visit, and I did not get one, which felt right. A thing like that is not a repeating event. A thing like that is singular. The way a hard frost that saves the last apple crop is singular. The way a letter you didn't know was coming is singular. It happens once, and it is enough. Lloyd came up the road in early November to bring me a jar of his wife's Firewood honey, the way he did most years. He parked his truck and got out and stood in the yard and looked at the woodpile for a while. "You got that whole cord split," he said. "I did," I said. He looked at the 14-inch lengths at the top of the stack, and he nodded slowly, the way a man nods when something is adding up, but he's not ready to do the arithmetic out loud. "Good lengths for your stove," he said. "They are," I said. He left the honey on the porch rail and drove back down the road, and I did not explain anything, and he did not ask. Ray came up the second week of November the way he'd said he would. He pulled his truck in at around noon and got out, and stood in the yard looking at the ridge and the cabin and the hemlock line the way you look at a place you've been away from long enough that it's both familiar and not. He was heavier than I remembered. His hair was greyer. He had his mother's way of standing with his hands in his pockets when he was taking in something he wasn't ready to speak about yet. He looked at the woodpile and he looked at me, and he said, "I was worried you wouldn't have enough for the winter." "I've got enough," I said. He brought the casserole in and we ate at the kitchen table at noon, which was early, but we were both hungry in a way that had nothing to do with the time of day. He asked me about my lungs, which Dottie would have asked right away and which Ray had apparently been holding back for 3 hours of driving. I told him the truth, which was that they were what they were, no better, no worse than expected for the year. He looked at the table when I said it, and I looked at the table too, and after a moment we moved on to something else, the way men do. He stayed 3 days. We didn't do much. We walked the property line one afternoon, slow enough for both of us, him with his hands in his pockets and me taking the pace the ridge had taught me over 2 years of managing it alone. He asked about the flat stone and the corn dish, and I told him about his mother's ritual, which I was surprised to realize he didn't fully remember. He was young when she started it, I suppose. He stood and looked at the dish on the stone for a while without saying anything, and I thought I saw something in his face that I recognized, but couldn't name. On the last morning he was there, he loaded his truck, and we stood in the yard in the cold November air, with our breath making small clouds between us. And he said, "I'll come back at Christmas, if you want." I said I wanted. He drove down the ridge road, and I stood in the yard until his truck was gone, and the sound of it had faded out on the county road below. Biscuit sat beside me, and we looked at the empty road together for a while, and then I went inside and put a piece of wood in the stove. By late winter, January hard and the ridge locked under ice for weeks at a stretch, the woodpile was holding the way a woodpile holds when it was stacked right and the lengths are correct for the stove. I wasn't burning through it faster than I should. I was staying warm. My chest was doing what it did, no worse than expected, and on the days when it was worse, I did less, and on the days when it was manageable, I did what I could. And that arrangement was not new, but it felt less like defeat than it used to. Ray called every week now. Not long calls, not like the first one. 20 minutes, sometimes 30. His girlfriend's name was Patricia, and she taught elementary school in Roanoke, and she was going to come up in the spring, if I was agreeable. I said I was agreeable. I asked what she liked to eat, and he laughed, which was a sound I had not heard from him in 2 years, and which hit me somewhere in the center of my chest in a way that had nothing to do with the black lung. I've told this story twice. Once to my pastor in January, when he came up the ridge to check on me the way he did every few weeks during the hard cold. I told it plain, without embellishment, and he listened without interrupting, which is the mark of a good listener. He didn't say what he thought it was. He said he was glad I had enough wood. I said I was glad too. I am telling it now for the second time to you, because I think there are people who need to hear it, who are sitting somewhere alone in their own hard season, in their own narrowing, with a list of things they can no longer do that gets longer every year, and a phone they're not picking up, and a ritual they've let go of. I'm not going to tell you what the creature was. I genuinely don't know. And the not knowing has stopped bothering me in the way that things stop bothering you when you've been handed something you didn't earn and wouldn't have thought to ask for. What I know is what I saw. What I know is what was stacked in the woodyard at dusk on a Wednesday in October, and what length those rounds were cut to, and what that length meant to a 71-year-old man with progressive fibrosis and a winter coming on, and no one else on the ridge. If you've carried something like this, something you've seen or felt that you can't explain and can't quite put down, I'd be glad to hear it in the comments. Sometimes the only thing to do with a story you can't explain is to leave it somewhere it might find the right ears. The corn dish went out this morning. It goes out every morning now. I filled it from the blue pail on the bottom shelf of the pantry and carried it across the yard in the first grey light, my breath making small clouds in the cold air, Biscuit walking ahead of me the way he does, slow and certain on his old dog legs. I set the dish on the flat stone and I tapped it twice with my finger, the way she always did. The woodpile is still holding.